Check it out. It's the Laugh to Learn podcast. What is going on, everyone? Welcome to the Laugh to Learn podcast, your weekly source for a fun spin on all the news going on the world around. This is the Canadian Electoral Platform Special. Of course, one of my favorite episodes that I get to do every time there's a big election in either Canada or the United States. These episodes tend to be a little bit more popular, so thank you so much if you're checking it out for the first time or the first time in a long time. Welcome to the show. You can, of course, reach the Laugh to Learn podcast each and every Wednesday afternoon, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, fresh for download to listen to the entire world around. My name is Jacob Paveo, and I come to you from the Great White North at the time each and every week I just explained, doing some intros out of order, but it is what it is. You can, of course, reach me on social media. All the links are in the description for this episode. You can find our website with a whole merch store and everything. You can get yourself hooked up. It's cold here in central Ontario right now. It's getting cooler. I was wearing the Laugh to Learn sweater yesterday for a walk, and I'll be wearing another one of the, I'll probably wear the long sleeve shirt today during the day because it's quite chilly. You can find all those products and more, including a mug, so you can drink your nice hot coffee, tea, latte. It's a little big for an espresso, but I mean, you could do it if you want to. You can find all of that over at www.laughtolearnpodcast.com/store. Once again, thank you guys. So we're just going to jump right into it this week. The idea of this episode is to go through the platforms of the three major parties in this upcoming federal election. Now, right off the hop, it's important to note that technically, there are 5 major parties, but in reality, there are 6 major parties right now in Canadian politics. So I have to answer the question off the hop, why am I only covering the big 3? So, of course, the big 3 are the Liberal Party, who are currently in power. Justin Trudeau is, of course, their leader. We also have the Conservative Party, who are the official opposition right now, the second most powerful party in the country, run by Erin O'Toole. And then third, we have the NDP, the New Democratic Party. Although they don't call themselves that anymore, they're now just the NDP, which is an interesting change, who are led, of course, by Jagmeet Singh. Now, these 3 leaders we talk about all the time on the podcast. They're the big players in Canadian politics, but we also have some of the smaller parties. So we have the Bloc Québécois, who is led currently right now by Yves-François Blanchet. So they are going to be considered a major party in this upcoming election. And then finally, the Green Party, who is led by Annamie Paul. Of course, the Green Party, historically, I think the most they've ever had were 3 seats federally. And then we have the 6th party, which is discussed at least online as a major party, although they did not reach the percentages of population in early polls to be included in the upcoming debates, but that is the People's Party of Canada, run by Maxime Bernier. Of course, if you recall the 2019 election, I did a whole episode on Maxime Bernier and the People's Party of Canada. And if you're interested, you can just search. If you just search his name in my podcast on whatever platform you're listening to, it should show up with that old episode. But in reality, the reason I'm only going to be covering the big 3 is because technically the People's Party of Canada actually, like Maxime Bernier, cannot become prime minister. He is not on enough ballots for that to happen. So, of course, to become prime minister in Canada, you need to have not a majority, but a surplus of individuals serving in the House of Commons who represent your party. So the People's Party of Canada doesn't have enough individuals running to reach a minority level where Maxime Bernier could become prime minister. Now, there is, of course, because of how things are done in a parliamentary system, there is the chance that Bernier gets elected, and there is a split between, likely it would have to be a split in power between the Bloc and the Conservative Party, and I don't know, maybe you could argue the Liberals, and then if they can't decide on a leader, Maxime Bernier could be chosen, but he never would be. So there's like this crazy outside way that he could find himself as prime minister, but it's definitely not going to happen. So that's why we're not going to talk about the People's Party of Canada. Now, the Green Party and the Bloc... Oh, and as an aside, like Maxime Bernier did not get elected in 2019, and he's not expected to be elected this year as of right now. Of course, things could change, but he's not even a member of Parliament. So now, why aren't we going to cover the Green Party and the Bloc today? Simply because the odds of them actually achieving significant power in the country is just so low. Of course, the Bloc has very little support outside of Quebec, and Quebec is currently voting majority Liberal as opposed to Bloc. And then there's a few Conservative seats, especially to the west of the province, to the east of the province, typically more Liberal. The Bloc have no chance. And the Green Party, as I said earlier, 2 or 3 seats is like the most it's really what they do each and every election federally. They are a really popular party in BC, but for some reason federally they just don't have much of a grip. But nonetheless, when it comes to the Liberals, Conservative, and NDP, of course, as usual, the NDP are projected to remain in third position even after this election. It is suspected that they will lose a few more seats, and those seats will probably be taken by the Liberal Party. So really this comes down to the Liberals and Conservatives, but the NDP achieve enough seats to where their platform actually matters, because as we can see right now, where the Liberals don't have a majority, it really becomes important for them to give the NDP what they want, because the NDP have been voting with the Liberal Party consistently. So the Conservatives, to really get a grasp of things right now, would need to find themselves in a majority. I would assume if the Conservatives win this government by a minority, we will see an election early next year, because the Liberals and the NDP would link their seats together and cause a vote of no confidence. But we can cover all that in the future. Right now, we're dealing with this one election. That was just to quickly answer the question of why am I only covering these 3 parties. I know a lot of people are supporters, especially of the Green Party, my listeners. I actually have never been approached by someone who's a Bloc voter through the podcast. I do know individuals who are. But the Green Party is something that a lot of people voice their support about, and I've had people complain that I don't cover their platform enough on the podcast. The thing is, it's just not big enough. It's really, like, I'm sorry to say it like this, but at this point in time, their platform is irrelevant. They're just not getting the support. And I think, honestly, a big part of that is their party name. I think they should change the party name. It makes them sound like a one-issue party, which, for those of you who either know the Green Party well or follow Canadian politics quite in depth, you know that they're not a one-issue party. Certainly, they were formed as a one-issue party. That's why they call themselves the Green Party. However, over time, it's been made quite plain, especially through, I think, Elizabeth May. I'm pretty sure was her name. The 2 leaders ago of the Green Party, she really brought them forward, creating proper party platforms and everything. She was the first Green Party member to be elected as a member of parliament, and she grew them to more than just a one-issue party. The problem is that when the general public hears the name Green Party, they just assume, like, okay, let's lower carbon emissions, let's tax people for buying gas, and what else are they going to do, right? So, either way, let's move on because the Liberals, Conservatives, and the NDP are the important parties here. Now, I gathered this information from CTV News. Historically, I have always used CTV News election platform guide, even if you go back to my previous Canadian elections, provincial elections, and federal elections. CTV News tends to actually do the best. Now, it is important to note that they have a slight conservative spin on things especially when they're discussing the Liberal government. So it's important to note, but the facts are the facts. What they mention parties' positions on certain issues are typically those issues. So, without any further ado, I've decided to highlight some specific categories that I think are interesting that we're going to go through. I could sit here for 4 hours and go through every single issue, but let's just break it down for what it is. So I'm going to talk about climate change and energy, economic recovery and jobs, Indigenous reconciliation, and the reason for that is a lot of supporters of the podcast are really into the episodes I've done on Indigenous rights in Canada, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, and so I figured it would be a good thing to cover. Pandemic preparedness, which I think is going to, everyone knows, it is one of the biggest issues of this current election. Students and education, Parliament and ethics, which, of course, the Liberal Party is quite interested in correcting. Global affairs, public safety and national security would be the last topic we're going to discuss. So, up first was climate change and energy. So in each case, I'm going to discuss the current Liberal platform, the Conservative platform, and then the NDP platform, just to keep things simple, and I'll also throw in any of my own comments as we go. So the Liberals have vowed to bring national greenhouse gas emissions 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by the end of the decade, and to make Canada a net zero country by 2050. We don't know if the party will promise voters further action, as it has yet to release their full platform on green energy, but progress on one major pledge from 2019 remains murky at best. It's not at all clear how they plan to plant the 2 billion trees they vowed to in the 2019 election. Again, this is a conservative spin on what's happening, but they're not wrong. They did promise to plant 2 billion trees around the globe, and there's been no talk of it since then. Now, the Conservatives, the environmental section of the Conservative platform includes 4 pillars: implementing carbon border tariffs on China and other major polluters, increasing the adoption of zero-emissions vehicles, introducing a retail loyalty card-like carbon savings account for Canadians who purchase fuel, and meeting Canada's emissions reduction target under the Paris Climate Agreement, which is lower than the government's current goal. So the Conservative energy plan is actually slightly more progressive than the Liberals. Other than the Liberals have in place already the tax benefit for buying a net zero carbon car, not net zero carbon, but an all-electric vehicle. The Liberals had that in their platform in 2019, and they did implement it, and the Conservatives did not, though they're talking about keeping it. So at this point in time, the Conservatives are actually a little bit more progressive. Now, the NDP, during the 2019 campaign, Jagmeet Singh memorably discussed Liberal leader Justin Trudeau's environmental record with 4 words, saying, quote, "You bought a pipeline," end quote. But since then, the two have been more or less in agreement on the climate file, with the NDP backing the Liberals' net zero bill. It remains to be seen if Singh will be using this election to once again set his party apart from the Liberals on climate matters. I can assure you, in the debates, which are happening September 9th, will be the English debate. The 8th will be the French debate. I assure you the NDP will be trying to separate themselves from the Liberals on that front. Now, economic recovery and jobs. This is a huge part with, of course, everything reopening. So the Liberal Party took on debt so Canadians wouldn't have to, quote unquote, over the last year and a half, pouring out billions of dollars to help with job loss, profit declines, and soaring rent payments amid the many waves of COVID-19. Their spring budget projects the deficit to sit at $354.2 billion for the year that just ended, with it slated to drop to $154.7 billion in this current fiscal year. If re-elected, they've committed to extend most key COVID-19 benefits into the fall, including the rent and wage subsidies for businesses and the benefits that support Canadians out of work or sick due to the virus. They would also extend the business hiring program to March 2022. For the tourism sector specifically, they pledged to pay up to 75% of rent and income expenses for qualifying businesses between September and May of 2022. Through these promises and more, they plan to restore 1 million jobs lost from the pandemic. More of the same. We've seen what they've been doing. Now, the Conservative Party has criticized the governing Liberals for being overindulgent in their pandemic spending and has proposed a plan to tone it down in a responsible way, quote unquote, as part of their 5-point recovery framework. They pledge to balance the budget over the next decade. Specifically on job creation, if elected, they would create the Canada Job Surge Plan, which would pay up to 50% of the salary of new employees for 6 months following the phasing out of the current wage subsidy. They would encourage companies to spend money by providing a 5% investment tax credit in 2022 and 2023, encourage wealthy Canadians to invest in small businesses by providing a 25% tax credit on amounts up to $100,000, and provide a business loan of up to $200,000 for small businesses in the hospitality, retail, and tourism sectors. Through these promises and more, they plan to restore 1 million jobs lost to the pandemic. So 2 different approaches with the same end goal in mind. The difference being, of course, the Conservatives are encouraging internal investment. The Liberals are directly paying the companies to keep them afloat. So the Conservatives are trying to create new businesses, essentially, and give loans to keep existing businesses afloat. The Liberals are simply paying out current businesses to keep them afloat. The NDP has acted as the Liberals' main dancing partner in getting emergency COVID-19 benefits passed through Parliament. If elected, they would extend the wage and rent subsidies until small businesses are able to, quote, fully reopen, end quote. Whatever that means. They also plan to implement a hiring bonus to the foot of the employer portion of employment insurance and CPP, Canadian Pension Plan, for new hires, establish a $15 an hour minimum wage, rising to $20 an hour, indexed to the cost of living in the region. So essentially, businesses will have to pay less into EI and CPP if they are hiring new individuals, and of course, increasing minimum wage based on region. This is something that will never come to be, at least not anytime soon. The cost of a program like that would be astronomical, because then you have to start having debates about the difference in the cost of living between one city and another, right? So we have the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, which is encompassed en masse by the Golden Horseshoe, which is the horseshoe-shaped region around Lake Ontario. Well, the cost of living in the Golden Horseshoe is extremely vast because on both ends you have Cornwall on one side and Niagara Falls on the other side, which are both rather inexpensive places to live. And then in the middle you have the Greater Toronto Area, the GTA. So you have to somehow get a group to balance the proportionate costs of living in each of these areas on an ongoing basis. It would be extremely expensive. But either way, 3 different attempts to solve the same problem. So, Indigenous Reconciliation. Now, this is extremely important to so many people. In their budget in April, the Liberals promised $18 billion over 5 years to improve quality of life and create new opportunities for people in Indigenous communities. This investment will go towards closing gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations, advance reconciliation, and support continued action on clean water. They promised to take a new approach to addressing missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, including funding to address root causes of the violence, such as access to housing, poverty, and loss of culture and languages. In addition, they are promising to boost funding to on-reserve services, such as education, health and social services, and more. They commit to continue supporting access to clean water. Now, the Conservatives are promising to right past wrongs by implementing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I really cannot read. I was going to say the Truth and Reconciliation Commission already exists. That doesn't make sense. No, they're going to implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations 71 through 76, which are funding the search for unmarked graves on the lands of former residential schools and erecting a monument in Ottawa to commemorate the children who died in these institutions. I really don't know about the idea of erecting a monument, paying to do that when we still haven't found all the unmarked graves. Let's take things one step at a time, but okay. They also promised to recognize clean drinking water as a human right and put an end to water advisories in Indigenous communities. I have no idea why that hasn't happened yet. And let's not forget that internet has been listed as a basic human right. They also aim to reduce suicides among Indigenous populations with $1 billion in funding to boost mental health and drug treatment programs and support the development of programs by and for Indigenous people. That's a really good idea. They also promise to build the economy in Canada's north and support life there by implementing the Northern Housing Strategy, improve nutrition north, double the residency deduction, and ensure the territories receive their fair share in infrastructure funding. I think the big thing here is the Liberals really own the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls issue, and so the Conservatives have to find a way to win over voters on these issues without just stealing the plan the Liberals have, because it's actually their plan rather is quite strong. Now, the NDP are promising to fully fund the search of all former residential school grounds for unmarked graves, maintenance, commemoration, reburial, and protection of residential school burial sites per the wishes of survivors and their family members, which is, of course, quite difficult to do because you have to figure out who these people are, which is one of the ongoing issues with these unmarked graves we're finding. The NDP also pledged to fully implement all 94 TRC calls to action, and again, the TRC is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They promised to work with Indigenous people to develop a national action plan for reconciliation and will establish a National Council for Reconciliation. Which, again, very expensive to do, but in this case, I actually think that wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea. New Democrats promised to work with Indigenous women, the families of those missing and murdered, and their communities to implement the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry's calls for justice, including a plan to address violence against Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQ2S plus people. No, I can't tell you what all those letters in that acronym mean. And no, I don't think the issue right now, this bothers me. I'm going to talk about this quickly. We don't need to put the gay community into these sorts of issues when there is something so much bigger going on. And that's the problem I find with the NDP and more further left parties, because it's a really good idea to have this inquiry's calls for justice with a plan to address violence against these women and girls. I absolutely believe in that, right? But the gay community can simply be included in that if you're talking about against either transgendered, like male to female, or gay women or something like that, because that's the issue. The issue is not gay Indigenous men going missing and getting murdered. That's not the issue. The issue is females. Females. Whether trans, male to female, or born female, that is where the issue lies. So in missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is inclusive of everyone involved, right? We don't need to mention the fact that they have a different skin color. We don't need to mention the fact that they're gay or lesbian or whatever the case may be. That's not the issue. The issue is the fact that they present as females and they're being picked up typically by truck drivers and raped and murdered. That's the issue. So I don't like throwing in the gay community to kind of, in my opinion, swing a few more votes without actually changing your plan. Because it doesn't change your plan in any way. It just sounds and looks better on a board. Continuing with that, the NDP promised to work closely with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit to combat climate change, including expanding the Indigenous Guardians program, create Indigenous-led protected areas, and work closely with Indigenous leaders and communities to develop action plans to respond to climate change. All very good. I actually think in this case, all three parties have really solid plans. Now, pandemic preparedness. After setting up a made-in-Canada manufacturing program and fighting through the wild west of procurement, the Liberals did not have quite a smooth rollout, but in the end, Canada had enough vaccine doses in-country for everyone who is eligible 2 months ahead of schedule. They've now signed contracts for boosters if they're needed in the upcoming years. They've promised to make COVID-19 vaccines mandatory for federal public service workers, as well as those in federally regulated transportation sector, warning of, quote, consequences, end quote, for those who don't roll up their sleeves. They've also pledged 10 paid sick days of leave for federal workers, money towards improved ventilation in schools, and their marquee commitment has been a $9 billion commitment to train and better pay thousands of new personal support care workers. All well and good. The Conservatives have strongly criticized the Liberals' handling of the pandemic so far and have promised to implement a Canada Emergency Preparedness Plan that would look at how to make Canada more ready to detect and counter looming health threats. It would also aim to prevent future pandemics, blah, blah, blah. That's kind of dumb to say. The party says it would investigate the origins of COVID-19 and would call a public inquiry into the Liberals' pandemic response with promises to patch any holes. It's really important to note that the Conservatives have made it quite clear they believe China is responsible for the pandemic and that they fully intend to find that the case and create an international pressure against China because of it. Something which I don't disagree with at all. The Conservative platform also includes vows to ramp up domestic production capacity and research. Conservatives would require unvaccinated Canadian passengers to present a recent negative test result or pass a rapid test before getting on a bus, train, plane, or ship, which is stricter than the Liberals' current position. And they would also require federal public servants who aren't vaccinated to pass a daily rapid test, which is basically what the Liberals are doing as well. Now, the NDP has teamed up at times with both the opposition and the Liberals. They've kind of gone back and forth. As for setting up future national health crises response, the NDP have said if they were in power, they'd support the lifting of the vaccine patents, something that no private business would ever agree to anyway, so it's kind of a dumb platform to take. In their 2021 platform, the party has also pledged to set up a crown corporation for vaccine production and start shoring up the country for future pandemics by setting up federally led domestic PPE manufacturing. So that is quite socialist of them. A little bit too far to the left for me. A crown corporation for vaccine production is a little ridiculous when we now have, of course, Canadian-owned businesses. It's actually not a Canadian-owned business, but businesses within Canada, specifically in Quebec, who are preparing for vaccine production. And the idea of them openly lifting the patents will never happen. There's way too much money to be made here. And these foreign companies just would make Canada not be allowed to manufacture vaccines. So I don't think it would be a wise move. Now, students in education. So during the course of the pandemic, the federal Liberals offered a relief benefit to students, paused loan repayments interest-free, and doubled the Canada Student Grant from $3,000 to $6,000. They promised to continue providing the larger grant for 2 more years, that of $6,000, and spend $721 million to help students find employment. This has been something that's been in play for a long time, and I don't know anyone that's ever benefited from it. Like, I don't know what that program does, but it's an old program. They just keep increasing the funding. But anyways, the party will also change the repayment assistance program so that graduates won't have to start repaying loans until they make at least $40,000. So currently, the federal portion of your loan, you don't have to pay back for 6 months. Here in Ontario, the provincial portion, you have to pay back right away. In my own personal experience, that $40,000 minimum is kind of irrelevant because even when you're making $40,000, like, it sounds like a lot to 18-year-olds, but when you're trying to, like, my payments are roughly $500 a month. So when you're making $400,000, remember that's before tax, and then you're paying a 15% tax on that, plus rent, and then you're expected to pay $500 a month. Like, it's a lot of money. And $40,000, it's not a helpful margin, but it's better than nothing, I suppose. Conservative Party leader Aaron O'Toole has promised to give new graduates up to $100,000 in tax breaks over their first 3 years out of school. This is something I've been saying for a long time. Don't make me pay taxes, I think, until my loans are paid off. Students who graduate as engineers, coders, or in the skilled trades would see a tax exemption of $200,000 over 5 years. Not a great idea, just in the sense that, like, coders can be designing video games and art and stuff like that. So, like, I think you have to be more specific on what kind of, you're looking for people in STEM specifically, right? Now, the party will also create post-secondary jobs programs to help international students stay in Canada. Super important. I know dozens of people who came and studied here, took a space in our schools and everything, that were international students that left right away because their visas expire and they have to leave. It's asinine that we can't keep them here. And they wanted to stay, but they just can't. Now, lastly, the NDP is promising to cancel up to $20,000 in federal student debt, put an immediate stop to loan payments during the pandemic, and eliminate student debt interest to make education more accessible. The party will also move away from loans and permanently double Canada student grants. Over the long term, the NDP says it will work with provinces and territories to cap and reduce tuition fees to eventually make post-secondary education free. Once again, this is just like a long shot. It's way too expensive for that to actually go through. It wouldn't happen. I think even for giving $20,000 in federal student loans, it's just the amount of money you're talking about is insane. And I really don't see it happening, but obviously time will tell. I think in this case, the Conservative Party's ideas are probably better, but I think that, like I've said on the podcast before, I really think that you shouldn't have to pay taxes until your student loans are paid off. So any federal taxes we pay and any provincial taxes we pay should be taken off at the same rate, but they should be applied to our student loans until they're paid off. So, because like people don't notice that they pay federal and provincial taxes every year, but you do. So say your federal taxes are 10% and your provincial are 5%. Well, 10% of every pay should go to your federal student loan, 5% to your provincial student loan, and then, every year you get like a recap of how much you've paid off, and then eventually, I would have paid off my loans a long time ago. They take off a lot of money in taxes, and it would allow people to live their lives much more freely, and I don't think the tax money earned on the first 3 or 4 years of someone's work are what's providing our country with significant funding. So I think it's better to take their tax money when they're not making a lot of money anyways, and then when they're older, doing better because they've gone to school, they've paid off their loans, they're now making money in investments because they can invest their money younger, and they're making more money at work. That's when all of their tax money can go to fund federal projects and whatnot. Anyways, moving on, we only have 3 more things to talk about. So first of all, Parliament and ethics. Now, of course, the Liberals here, I'm not even going to cover their platform because they have botched this completely, between SNC-Lavalin, which we've discussed, the We Day controversy, which we've discussed, and it's just unending, right? Unending. The amount of transparency that was just lost. They really screwed up when it comes to this in the last 3 years. So it's been a little crazy. Now, the Conservatives have, of course, been criticized for being obstructionist in the House of Commons, though their MPs did successfully pass some private members' bills in the last session. In terms of accountability and transparency, the party has promised to amend the Conflict of Interest Act to include higher penalties and to update the Lobbying Act to where they perceive as abuse of the system. This echoes similar promises made in 2019. The party is also promising to change the code of conduct for MPs to prevent members of parliament from collecting speaking fees while holding a seat in the House, and wants to make the Canadian Armed Forces and Department of National Defence ombudsmen as independent officers of parliament. That I completely disagree with. The Canadian Armed Forces and Department of National Defence should not be involved in overseeing what our parliamentarians do, because that gives them significant influence over said parliamentarians, depending on who is leading the armed forces at any given point in time. Need I remind you that only about 5 years ago, the individual who was running the Canadian Air Force was arrested for rape and sneaking into houses and stealing women's underwear and fucking sniffing underwear out of their dirty fucking laundry. So let's not do that. However, I completely agree with stopping them from collecting a speaking fee while they are current members of the House of Commons. That actually doesn't make sense to me that they're allowed to do that. We pay you enough money, you don't need a second job. The NDP has been the main party propping up the Liberals in Parliament and has spoken out against the government's use of procedural tools to cut off debate and shut down committee work into touchy subjects, which has been, of course, an ongoing issue. In general, the party wants to abolish the Senate, and in their 2021 platform, they promise to, quote, insist that the Senate change its rules to avoid legislative obstruction from unelected senators, end quote. Despite there being no clear path procedurally for this promise to become a reality, you would need... what would they need? I don't even know. I think to abolish the Senate, you would need the House of Commons to approve of it, and then you would need the Senate to approve of it, and then I believe you would need royal assent to permanently disassemble the House of Commons. So that would be the Governor General would have to agree to it. But even still, I don't know if legally the House of Commons could vote to abolish a higher level of government. And it might be interesting. Like, I'd have to read into this, but you might need the actual Queen of England to get involved with that. Because I'd have to read the Canada Act, but I don't think it's actually written down on how to abolish it, but I would have to reread the Canada Act when it comes to the Senate. It's a really weird idea because the Senate really doesn't do much. They just kind of oversee legislation, and they've only passed back like 2 or 3 bills every single cycle, and those bills always just get slightly amended and then passed through. So it's a weird hill to die on. Global affairs. Second last topic. The Liberals have pledged to continue to provide funds for the country's international COVID response, as well as allocate another $165 million for humanitarian assistance, including, or rather on top of that, a $288 million assistance for the I can never pronounce this properly the first time I read it. Rohingya crisis over 3 years. They have also pledged to accelerate the purchase of shares of the African Development Bank by 5 years. Nice. Good things to do. The conservatives have promised to use the Magnitsky Laws to impose sanctions on human rights abusers in China, Iran, and Russia. Of course, the Magnitsky Act is federal legislation based around a man. His last name was Magnitsky. He was a journalist, I believe, who was kidnapped and murdered by Vladimir Putin. And now this act is used to impose sanctions around the world on any human rights abuse, specifically around freedom of speech and expression, including gay, trans people, stuff like that. Not actually. I'm going to say this up front. When it comes to global affairs, I'm 100% in line with the conservatives here. They plan to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, something I've been saying we should do, and move the Canadian embassy there, and aim to join the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, a strategic alliance between the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India. Again, I have no idea why we are not a part of that already. The conservatives have also pledged to list Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization, which they obviously are, and to create an Office of Religious Freedom and Conscience to provide advice, engage in diplomacy, and inform international development programs. I'm not a big fan of the Office of Religious Freedom and Conscience. However, I agree with the rest of what they've said here. The NDP, however, have pledged, I shouldn't say however, but on the other hand, have pledged to boost Canada's international aid contributions to 0.7% of the gross national income. That's a lot of money. That's before taxes, just to note. And that's a lot of money. I haven't actually read this before. I haven't read what the NDP were doing on most of these things. And contribute more to the global fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Those are good. And support healthcare infrastructure in developing countries. They're promising support for nuclear disarmament and plans to recommit to peacekeeping missions and ensuring that Canadian-made weapons are not used in conflicts and human rights abuses in other countries. That's not really an issue right now. It's Japanese and American stuff that's being used. The NDP also promises to work towards a just and lasting two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. So there's nothing we can do about Israel and Palestine. There's nothing we can do about nuclear disarmament. So, I mean, some weird things to throw into their platform there, but nonetheless, here we are. So, as I said, I think what the Liberals are doing is fine. It's a lot more of the same, helping countries financially, and when it comes to foreign affairs, Trudeau's government has really let the U.S. lead, and we've just kind of supported them in everything, and that's done actually quite well. We haven't been involved in much. We got out of Afghanistan in time. Unfortunately, of course, there was a major terror attack by ISIS against the Taliban and American forces. It's super complicated over there because the Taliban are opposed to ISIS, and ISIS is opposed to the Taliban, so they're actually fighting. These terror groups are fighting. It's just so crazy. Anyways, lastly, we have to discuss public safety and national security. So the Liberals have promised to reestablish the Law Commission of Canada to provide guidance on legal matters to move forward with its 2019 promise of $144.9 million marked for cybersecurity of the country's infrastructure in the budget. They also promised a data commissioner to ensure personal data is used responsibly. All right, then. The Conservatives have promised to enact Clare's Law, requiring police to notify a victim of a suspect's relevant criminal history when they investigate domestic violence, and implement legislation to require that people convicted of multiple human trafficking offenses serve consecutive sentences. Now, Clare's Law is a big controversy in the U.S. So essentially, in some states, if you call because of domestic violence, right? Or someone calls on your house because of domestic violence. They come, and your boyfriend has a criminal record of any sort. They are required under law to tell the individual who was the victim in that case about that individual's criminal history. Again, no matter what the criminal history is, even if it's not relevant. The police are required to inform you. I don't actually know that it's a good idea because you can run a criminal background check on anyone. So, you know what I mean? Like if someone chooses not to. I don't think it's the police's responsibility to tell you. I'm actually against Clare's law. I think a responsible individual should do that homework themselves. If you're bringing someone around your children or whatever the case may be, you should probably find out more about them yourself. When it comes to people serving multiple human trafficking offenses being required to serve consecutive sentences, I also agree with that because I don't think you should ever mandate sentencing for a judge. I think a judge in any circumstance should be allowed to choose their sentencing. And that may sound extreme to people because it's like, I'm literally recommending you take it easier on human traffickers is what it may sound like. But in reality, we've seen what happened with mandatory sentencing in the U.S. when everyone thought it was okay for any drug crime to have mandatory sentences. And then you find out how it actually doesn't work. It may sound good up front, but I think a judge needs to have the ability to make that professional decision for themselves. That's why we appoint only the top lawyers in the country get appointed to a position of a judge. And I think it should remain that said judge should make the decision, not us, the voters, not our politicians. The Conservatives also pledged to hire an additional 200 RCMP officers in the Greater Toronto Area and provide $100 million over 5 years to support training for non-provincial police forces in areas like sexual exploitation, cybersecurity, and online offenses, including sexual offenses. I absolutely do not think that we as a country, and this is as someone who works in the GTA, the country does not need to be supplementing the city with police officers. They make a shit ton of money in local taxes. They have kick-ass police forces. We do not need as a nation to fund additional officers there. And then when it comes to firearms, they're talking about repealing Bill C-71 and C-21, making it a criminal offense to travel abroad to benefit from human rights abuses, banning puppy mills, strengthening the FDA Act to include a ban on cosmetic animal testing, and $10 million a year to train judges and prosecutors on the link between animal cruelty and domestic violence. That's actually really cool. Lastly, they have a hard line on China, pledging to ban Huawei from Canada's 5G infrastructure. Thank the Lord. Ban senior public office holders from contracts or employment with China, as they should, or affiliated entities for 5 years, to withdraw from the China-led Asian Infrastructure Bank and ban Chinese imports producer with Uyghur forced labor. Absolutely. I have no idea why the Conservatives are the ones who are against China, who are murdering Muslim people. It doesn't make sense. Clearly, that's who I agree with on that. The NDP has promised to strengthen protection for Canadians facing foreign threats and interference, update privacy legislation to include a boost in power for the Privacy Commissioner to enforce... I can't even read this. That is crazy as hell. They're giving more people more access to our information. That is crazy as hell. The NDP promised communities will have access to anti-gang funding projects to deter youth from criminal gangs and will focus on preventing youth from being radicalized with support for community-led initiatives. That's a really good plan. The NDP has pledged to ensure that all major cities have dedicated hate crime units. That's a little extreme, I think. Most already have it. I don't want the federal government involved in that. They also promised to create a national action plan to deal with white supremacist and neo-Nazi organizations in the country and to, quote, stand up to China, end quote, while supporting Hong Kong democracy asylum seekers and provide coordinated support for those facing threats by Chinese entities in China. So when it comes down to it, I'm in a really complicated position, as I think many people are right now, because the Liberal platform, it's not fully released yet. As you can tell, they didn't really have much to say. They haven't fully released their platform yet. But thus far, I shouldn't say completely, but the majority of the Conservative platform is what I agree with. However, I think Aaron O'Toole is a horrible leader. And that's kind of where we are. So I'm in a position where, not that I think Trudeau is a fantastic leader, but I think he does better than Aaron O'Toole internationally. And I think that's been proven. Domestically, Trudeau has been a mess, but internationally, he's got business taken care of. And yeah, it's going to be tough. I'm going to watch both elections. I'm going to watch obviously, I don't speak enough French or understand enough French to watch the French debate in French, but I'll watch a translated version. That is September 8th, from 8 to 10 p.m. Yeah, I got that right. And then September 9th from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. is the English debates. So, of course, that is next week on Thursday, Wednesday the 8th and Thursday the 9th. So I will be watching those closely. You guys should as well. It's super important to get involved with this stuff. At this point, being perfectly honest, I have no idea who I'm voting for. I know that I'm not voting for the NDP. Jagmeet Singh is someone who, no matter what the platform is, I couldn't vote for him because he cried when the image of Justin Trudeau in brownface came out. I've talked about this openly before. I think it's ridiculous, and I can't imagine him sitting in a room with Vladimir Putin and starting to cry about something. It's just a joke. So what it comes down to for me right now, it's a decision between Aaron O'Toole and, ironically, the more progressive platform that the Conservatives have put out, more progressive against China and the murder of the Muslim Uyghurs in northern China, against Huawei coming into our country, supporting Israel directly as opposed to indirectly, being opposed to the Iran National Guard. These are all super important things to me that I discuss all the time on the podcast, that finally a Canadian party is actually jumping on board with. I do worry, though, that the Conservative Party is jumping on board with these things just because they think it'll get them some more votes, and then they don't follow through with it. That is a genuine concern of mine, and I don't trust Aaron O'Toole as far as I could throw him. And I'm a small person. I can't throw you very far, Aaron. So it's a complicated position I'm in. I'm looking forward to the debates. Hopefully, we see some things that, or at least I see some things that help skew my position. Feel free to let me know where you guys stand on all this, who you're thinking of voting for, what your thoughts are on this upcoming election. This has been the Laugh to Learn podcast. This is, as I said off the top, it's one of my favorite episodes to do. I could talk about this for days and days and days, but eventually I got to cut it off. So we're going to do so at around the 50, whatever we're at, 2-minute mark now. So thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you pulled something important from this. Don't forget to discuss this with your friends and family. If you have kids, get them involved. When you're going to vote, I know it's a little bit more difficult because of COVID, but throw a mask on your child, bring them there so they can get involved in the process. It's one of the most important things you can do. If you have kids who are 17 or 18 or 19 years old that have never voted in an election, encourage them to do so. If you think a podcast like this is too much for them, no problem. They can watch like a 5-minute video on the parties and find who they like, and they're probably going to vote Liberal, NDP, or Green. You have to be okay with that, but I'm just letting you know. Just encourage them to do so. I hate when people say things like, don't vote Green because they're not going to win. It's like, I live in an area where the Conservative Party has won every election since I've lived here for 20 years, okay? Federal, provincial, it doesn't matter. The whole, our city politics are run primarily by conservative individuals. It's just the way that it is. But I've still voted in every election, and I've never voted conservative. So you just have to do your thing, and you have to encourage everyone to do their own thing, because you just never know. 2 elections ago, in my region, the Conservatives won by 61 votes. 61 votes. That's it. Now, in the last election, they won by about 2,000. But you never know, right? It swings back and forth. You never know what it's going to be. So, everyone needs to get out there and vote. Everyone needs to do their civic duty. And the number one mistake you can make living in a country like this, when we're looking at a place like Afghanistan where, literally all of these major countries are running out of there because of what's happening. You look at a place like North Korea where there's no food. People are dying in the thousands every week right now because of starvation. You look at a place like China where they are murdering people because they are Muslim. You look at all these places. You have to realize the one thing we can do is control our leadership. And obviously, there's no one who if they won, we would suddenly look like Afghanistan or China or North Korea or something like that. But it would be easy, given 100 years, for us to become that. And we don't want that to happen. We need to be involved. We need to constantly be aware of what's happening. We need to know what our rights are as citizens and vote for what makes us feel right. Just because I'm telling you what I think doesn't mean that's what you should think. If I just wanted a podcast of a bunch of people who think like me, I would literally record this and then play it for myself later and agree with it. Say, yeah, that guy's really smart, right? But that's not what I do. I put it out there for the whole world to hear and listen to and for people to make their own choices. So get out there, do your thing, vote for who you're going to vote for. Don't forget, next Wednesday is the French debate at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Next Thursday is the English debate at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Keep wearing those masks. Keep sanitizing your hands. Keep social distancing. Keep on voting. Keep on laughing. And keep on learning.